I'm Isabella Rosewood, and I knew I was about to be pushed out of my own home the moment my daughter looked at the pot of burnt soup and stayed quiet just a little too long. She didn't scold me, and she didn't ask if I'd burned myself. She just stood there, looking at me the way people look at something that's starting to break down. Too dangerous to keep, but not quite ready to throw away. Do you think I was going to cry and beg not to be sent to a nursing home? Stay with me until the end, because Isabella Rosewood has never known how to bow her head. Late November in Charleston was damp and cold. The wooden house still carried Robert's scent, as if he had only just stepped outside to water the garden. The only difference was that now I was the one being weighed, assessed, and sooner or later set aside somewhere out of sight of the people who were supposed to love me. After 35 years as an oncology nurse, I knew the body's unraveling by heart. I had held strangers' hands while they signed consent forms. I had brushed young women's hair before surgery. I thought I had grown immune to it all. But when the trembling found its way into my own hands, all that medical knowledge suddenly became useless against the pounding of my heart in my throat. At first, it was only a teaspoon shaking slightly. Then my handwriting started drifting off the lines in my church notebook. One morning, the garden hose slipped out of my hand and smacked my foot hard. I stood there, watching it roll across the grass like it belonged to someone else. Even buttoning a cardigan became a struggle. Those little things sound dramatic when you say them out loud, but old age always starts collapsing through tiny cracks like that. The soup burned on a rainy evening. Sarah called, asking about Josh's school festival in a hurried voice. I answered her for a minute and completely forgot the burner. By the time the smell hit the upstairs hallway, the bottom of the pot was black. Sarah came over 20 minutes later. She didn't panic, and she didn't blame me. She looked at the pot, then at me, then at the stovetop with the eyes of someone silently marking a line in an inventory book. "This is happening more often now, Mom." I was about to argue, but when I looked at that blackened pot, I stayed quiet. Sarah was 38, a high school teacher. At that age, she was quick, tidy, and already beginning to lose patience with anything slow. In her eyes, I was no longer her mother. I was a mess that needed to be cleaned up neatly and efficiently. And Benjamin, her brother, lived all the way out in California. He called every Sunday like a wind-up machine, and he sent money right on time whenever the roof leaked or a pipe cracked. He had chosen to stand far enough away that all my struggles had turned into emotionless numbers on a phone screen. They had both found their own ways to survive the 2 funerals for Michael and Robert. One ran as far as he could. The other stayed too close. I was the only one left in this house, quietly washing dishes, paying bills, trying to hold on to the idea that grief would wear down eventually the way the wooden stairs had worn smooth beneath our feet. But it didn't. That grief never wore down. It just lay there like an animal waiting in the dark, shifting now and then to remind me it was still awake. All it took was one time slipping on the porch and one afternoon falling asleep in the chair, while Sarah called me over and over with no answer, and suddenly the house became a crime scene full of mistakes. Every familiar corner was relabeled. The wooden staircase became a hazard. The kitchen corner became a fall risk. The bathtub I soaked in every evening was suddenly an unsafe zone. All the things that had been my breath, my rhythm, my daily life for decades instantly turned into hard evidence in the case against their unstable mother. At a certain age, you learn that being insulted isn't when someone raises their voice at you. The deepest pain comes when the things most familiar to you get relabeled with cold words. Dangerous, inconvenient, needs intervention. Just a few words, but enough to turn a mother into a problem to be managed. Everything in the house started to feel different even before there was any official conclusion. Sarah looked at me like she had already memorized an ending that wouldn't go well for me. Every few days, Benjamin called, and the first thing out of his mouth was always whether my hands were still shaking. Early one morning, an envelope from the hospital lay still beneath the front door slot. When I bent down to pick it up, all 10 of my fingers tangled and shook against the edge of the paper. Sunlight landed squarely on the name, Isabella Rosewood. I carried it to the dining table and set it in Robert's place. I hadn't opened it yet, but I knew this was the opening shot. They were about to tidy up my life and put it in order. The name Parkinson's wasn't as frightening as the way my daughter had started talking about her mother, as if I were an extra room with too much furniture in it. On a cold, sunny Thursday morning, I drove to the medical center. the smell of floor cleaner mixed with stale coffee, that smell I had lived with for 30 years in medicine, suddenly felt eerily unfamiliar. Amanda Whitmore checked me in with perfect composure. Crisp white coat, polished voice, and not a trace of warmth anywhere on her. The tests began one after another. Walk in a straight line, touch your nose, write your name, button your sweater. The pen shook in my hand. Looking at the crooked handwriting at the bottom of the page, I felt as if some stranger had quietly edited the identity I had carried my whole life. Amanda set the file down. "Mrs. Rosewood, I believe this is early-stage Parkinson's." The sounds around me seemed to fall away, as if a pane of thick glass had come down between me and the world. I asked about living alone. Amanda said it was still possible, but that I needed to start considering long-term support options early. The word considering sounded soft as cotton, but after all my years in the field, I knew those gentle phrases in medical records always led somewhere far away. I drove home and sat in the garage, staring at the sunlight across the wooden gate. Bad news is like an unwanted guest. It stands at the door, takes off its shoes, hangs up its coat, and only then does it settle in. Sarah picked up immediately when I told her. After a few seconds of silence, she exhaled, and I heard a cabinet door slam. "I knew it. See, Mom, this house isn't workable anymore." "It was just today, Sarah. I'm not saying you have to leave right now, but we have to be realistic." I hated the word realistic. It was usually just a pretty covering laid over decisions that had already been made. Benjamin called back an hour later. He asked about medication in a voice that sounded sincere but solution-driven. The voice of someone standing far enough away to treat struggle as logistics. He said Sarah was right to worry, and that he could cover the cost of a caregiver or equipment installation. I hung up, my palms ice cold. 2 children, 2 tones of voice, but one shared view. I had become a burden that needed handling. 2 days later, Sarah brought over a stack of brochures printed with bright rooms, beige armchairs, and silver-haired women smiling beside nurses. "I never said I was going anywhere." "I know, but you need to understand your options." "Whose options?" "Yours. But you have to look at reality. This house has too many dangerous corners." "It's my home." "Yes, but you're not safe here anymore." She said it in a dry, quick voice, as if slowing down might make her soften. I flipped through the brochure and saw the Harbor Transition Services logo and a folded page listing prices. "Where did you get this?" "From a consulting service. A coworker recommended them." She turned and adjusted the vase on the table, avoiding my eyes for exactly half a second. That half second was enough. My daughter was lying. She wasn't just worried about me. She was planning to liquidate my life. Sarah had always touched something when she lied. As a child, it was the corner of a tablecloth. Now it was fussing with the flower vase on the dining table. She looked away for only the blink of an eye, but it was enough for me to see that she was quietly trying to rearrange my life out of sight. In the weeks that followed, her lines started repeating themselves, whether in the kitchen or out in the yard, always circling the same idea: assisted living. "Just think about it, Mom. A 1-story place would be easier. If a nurse handled your medication, I'd feel better. If we sold this house, at least we wouldn't have to worry about future costs." The word we stung. I didn't remember giving anyone shared ownership of this house or the right to carry my worries alongside me. One afternoon, while I was wiping down the kitchen table, Sarah walked in with her phone in her hand. "I know someone in real estate. Just to ask what the market value is, so we know what we're working with, Mom." I put the towel down. "What did you do?" "I just asked." "No, you don't ask. Mom, knowing the price doesn't mean selling." "Sarah, I'm just trying to plan ahead." "Plan ahead for what? For me? For my house? Or for the money after it's sold?" She flushed, not from shame, but from being exposed too quickly. She turned away, opened the refrigerator, then slammed it shut. "I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who has to come running every time something happens, while Benjamin is all the way in California. Don't I have the right to think ahead?" I almost softened at that, until her phone screen lit up on the table. A text preview showed half a line. "If your mother chooses Sunset Garden, Harbor can finalize the referral package this week." My whole body went cold. Needing help and being put on the market were 2 completely different things. One had dignity, the other smelled like a transfer of ownership. If you're still listening this far, leave me a period, a heart, or even just one word. I want to know if someone is still here with me. And keep listening, because what I was about to find in the attic hurt even more than that pot of burned soup ever did. On Monday morning, while I was waiting for Sarah to bring over soup, I went up to the attic looking for insurance papers. Between old picture frames and Christmas linens, I pulled Robert's leather suitcase out of a dark corner. Behind it was a dark tin box with a rusted lid. Taped across the top was a yellowed note in my husband's handwriting. For Isabella, when you feel strong enough. I dropped to my knees on the dusty wooden floor, my joints cracking sharply. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press both palms onto the lid to steady them. Downstairs, the refrigerator clicked on for a second, then went silent again. The Parkinson's diagnosis, the beige brochures, the calculations my children were making, all of it suddenly faded into the background, and I understood something. Sometimes what the dead leave behind isn't meant to make them remembered. It's meant to make the living understand why someone has been targeting their life. That tin box didn't just hold my husband's secret. It held the feeling of a hand that had been quietly reaching into our lives for decades. The attic smelled that day of old wood, dry dust, and the faint leather scent from the suitcase Robert had taken on his last trip to Asheville. I set the box on my lap. The note on the lid was written in the same familiar slant. For Isabella, when you feel strong enough. Strong enough. Robert had always understood that some truths never disappear. They only wait until a person is strong enough not to collapse when they touch them. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry, just fragile things that carried the real blows. A bundle of old letters tied with string, wire transfer receipts, and photocopies of contracts covered in crossed-out lines. I skimmed them first to understand the larger picture before going to the most painful part. In 1985, Robert left his job managing medical equipment to try building a project with his best friend, Thomas Whitmore. I remembered Thomas, the man who always wore a tailored blazer to every cookout, smiled at just the right moment, and smelled faintly of cologne. Robert admired him, the way an honest man admires someone sharper than himself. They had developed an herbal pain relief formula together. Robert handled the clinical testing, Thomas handled market relationships. The earliest notes were full of hope. Thomas says if we get investors early, we'll have leverage. If this works, maybe we can finally pay off Michael's medical bills. I stared at that last line for a long time. Medical bills. Back in the 80s, Michael was in and out of the hospital constantly because of asthma. Some nights, Robert sat up until dawn doing the math, counting every dollar for inhalers and nebulizers. As the papers went on, Robert's tone changed from hopeful to cautious, then confused. Thomas postponed another meeting. Says the investors want a cleaner ownership structure. I don't like that phrase. He told me not to mention the original notes in front of the partners because it would muddy the story. I haven't signed anything. Thank God. He met with the Richmond group without telling me. In the stack of letters, Thomas's warm brother language slowly disappeared, replaced by cold words like timing, positioning, clean transfer. In one unfinished contract, Robert's name had been pushed down from partner to technical advisor, then vanished completely from the profit-sharing section. In the margin, Robert had penciled, "This is not what we agreed to." In another spot, he asked me to sign after I'd been drinking bourbon, said it was the old draft. It wasn't. I'm not a lawyer, but I was his wife. One look was enough to understand. Thomas Whitmore had pushed Robert out by changing words, shifting schedules, and switching papers at a table with liquor on it. Thomas Whitmore had not betrayed him openly. He chose the method of men who know how to survive in polite society. Change the wording, reschedule the meetings, hold private conversations, and call exclusion streamlining the structure. So by the time Robert understood, every lock had already been changed. Then I opened the final envelope. Robert's handwriting in his last years still fought to stay neat and straight. Isabella, if you are reading this, then maybe I no longer had the time, or the courage, to tell you this while I was alive. I let out a long, trapped breath. The truth appeared in the voice of a man who had carried shame for too long. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because someone had stolen his work, and he had endured it in silence. Robert had once intended to sue, but just then, Michael died. I fell apart, and the medical debt closed in around us. Thomas showed up at the funeral in an elegant black suit, hugged Robert in front of everyone, and whispered, "Don't make a mess of things now. Your family needs peace." Robert wrote, "I hate admitting this, but I chose silence. Not because I forgave him, but because I was too cowardly to face the price of a war. I couldn't bear seeing you lose any more. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to beat a man like Thomas." Shock wrapped itself around my mind. Nearly 40 years together, sleeping beside each other, burying our son together, and yet this dark pocket of humiliation had never once come into the light. It turns out a man's silence can sometimes be a disease more frightening than cancer. These papers had not been kept to make anyone rich. They had been kept to prove that my dead husband had not been weak or foolish. I knew very early. I just never fought back. That was the greatest failure of my life, after letting you carry too much for too long. Down in the yard, I heard Sarah's car. A door slammed, then her voice. "Mom, are you up there?" I hurried to gather the papers back into the box, keeping only the letter in my hand. I needed to sit with this in the dark a little longer before dragging it into the light. As I came down the narrow, dusty stairs, my knees throbbed. Sarah was waiting at the bottom with a bag of food in her hand. "What took you so long?" "Looking for some papers." "You should let me help with that. It's dangerous for you to be climbing around." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the bag of soup and apples she was holding. Everything about it looked reasonable, kind even. But at that moment, the name Thomas Whitmore had taken over my mind. It was everywhere in Charleston. On the brass plaques at the hospital, on scholarship funds, on private clinics. And only a week later, I was horrified to realize that name wasn't just out there somewhere. It was pressed right up against the walls of my life, much closer than I had ever imagined. 2 days after finding the tin box, I still cooked, watered the plants, and went to service at Grace Methodist like always. At night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to branches scrape across the porch roof, my chest feeling as heavy as if someone had set a brick on it. Some new kinds of pain arrive in a way that leaves you unable to scream. Sunday morning, the service ended with a tribute to the Whitmore family for their donation to the senior program. Sitting in the third pew, my hand resting on the hymnal, I heard that name ring out over the microphone with deep respect. The continued generosity of the Whitmore family. Applause burst through the room. I sat completely still, feeling as though my soul had stepped out of me and was standing outside, watching my body sit there alone in the middle of the crowd. Whitmore. That name was everywhere. On the brass plaque on the hospital's new wing, in Josh's scholarship brochure, on the fundraising gala banner, and on the chain of clinics out by the highway. It belonged to Charleston. And Robert, the man who had been robbed of part of his life, was now lying beneath a simple stone in the South Cemetery, his name only just large enough for people passing by to read. Evelyn Parker tugged at my arm after the service. The Lord will make a way, and the Whitmores donate so much to the elderly too. Such precious people. I smiled the kind of smile you use to cover the sharp pain behind your ribs. That night, I spread the stack of hospital records across the table. Amanda Whitmore's name appeared on the very first page, in the top right corner. Amanda Whitmore, M.D. Never had a name carried such a bitter taste of betrayal. After staring at that last name longer than necessary, I turned on the computer in the small room next to the kitchen. It took less than 3 minutes for the truth to come spilling out. A photo of Thomas Whitmore standing on a gala stage, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. Amanda Whitmore, neurologist, youngest member of the Charleston Health Board, only daughter of the philanthropist Thomas Whitmore. The mouse in my hand suddenly went still. Some coincidences are merely unsettling, but this one sent a chill all the way through me. That first appointment came back in perfect detail. The way Amanda tilted her head when she mentioned appropriate living arrangements. The way she emphasized the line about living alone in a multi-level home. The way she pressed me about support people. At the time, I thought she was being careful. Looking back now, every sentence felt like another brick laid neatly into a road that had already been planned. Suspicion is not proof, but 30 years in the profession had taught me one lesson by heart. When a doctor lets outside motives slip into a patient's chart, the patient is always the first one to pay the price. The next afternoon, Sarah came by again, carrying frozen lasagna and fruit. She had always known how to turn care into something impossible to refuse. Leaning against the kitchen counter, she said it as casually as if it had just crossed her mind. I checked back with Harbor. They said if you want, they can finish the paperwork for Sunset Garden really fast. I turned and looked at my daughter. You talked to them again? I just asked. How long have you been working with them? Sarah shrugged. Since the day you slipped on the porch. So, before the doctor even confirmed Parkinson's? If you want the truth, yes, before that, because I'm not blind. That sentence dropped into the kitchen like a blade. My daughter had started putting her mother's freedom on the market before I had even had time to learn I was sick. That answer made me stop cold. My daughter didn't yell. She just spoke in a voice that sounded exhausted and brutally direct. When did you start thinking I needed to leave this house? Sarah turned away and turned on the faucet, the rush of water covering her discomfort. She shut it off and stood there with her back to me. Not leave right away. It's just, you're not the way you used to be. I stepped closer, my voice low but hard. I really want you to say all of it, Sarah. Better to say it straight once than keep quietly making plans behind my back. Sarah looked at me, her eyes rimmed red. It means I don't want to get a call one day saying you fell in the bathtub. It means I don't want to live juggling bills, school stuff, my kids, and still have to stay on edge, ready to rush over here in the middle of the night just because you forgot your phone. I don't want to keep waiting for something bad to happen. The anger didn't rise. What took hold of me instead was a quiet sadness. So that's why you plan to sell my house? I was only looking into it. And how much is Harbor paying you if the paperwork goes through? Sarah froze for a split second. Who told you that? It's just a service fee. They support the referring person because of the work involved with the paperwork. The transition. I cut her off, my voice ice cold. How much, Sarah? She gripped the edge of the sink and bit her lip. 12,000. The number landed in the kitchen so softly, but it made the air around me turn thick. $12,000 for helping them push your mother somewhere else? Don't say it like that. I'm not pushing you anywhere. I'm just trying to do the sensible thing while Ben is far away, and you keep acting like everything is still standing still the way it was 5 years ago. My fingers dug into the edge of the table to hide the shaking. When did you start seeing this house as an amount of money that could be converted? From the moment I realized everything was eventually going to land on me. It wasn't a clean answer, but it was an honest one. The exhaustion of the child who stayed close and always had to carry the heavier load had hardened into a sense of control. Sarah's mistake had started with very small steps she kept forgiving herself for. I held Sarah's gaze until she had to look away first. When the sound of her car finally disappeared, I placed my medical records beside the old photo of Robert and Thomas Whitmore smiling over glasses of iced tea all those years ago. 2 Whitmores. One stole my husband's past. The other was now deciding the present of his wife. That night, I called Pastor David Peterson, one of Robert's old friends. His voice was still low and warm. Isabella, is something wrong? I want to ask you about Thomas Whitmore, and about what Robert kept hidden. The line went quiet, a silence long enough before he finally spoke softly. I always thought there would come a day when you made this call. My grip tightened around the receiver, my hand trembling lightly on its own. What do you know? Not enough to say everything over the phone, Isabella. I only need to know if Robert ever told you anything. Yes. That one word sent a cold rush straight down my spine. Can you come by the church office tomorrow? I've kept something Robert sent me. It's not much, but the time has come for it to belong to you. After I hung up, I sat silently at the dining table. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of cars passing outside the porch. Everything was strangely normal. But inside me, the grief had turned into the coldness of clarity. I still hadn't exposed Amanda, hadn't confronted Thomas, and didn't yet know what I was going to do about Sarah or that harbor company. But I understood one thing. This house was no longer just a home with stairs that were easy to fall on. It had become an obstacle someone wanted cleared away as fast as possible. The next morning in the small room behind the church, sitting across from Pastor David, I finally understood why they were in such a hurry. The person who told me plainly why they wanted me out of the house was not my daughter or the doctor, but a lawyer with eyes that could read through a file the way someone else might look through skin. But before I met Jackson Moore, I went to the church. Pastor David's office smelled strongly of old paper and polished wood. On the wall hung an old youth group photo with Robert smiling, his hand resting on David's shoulder. I had walked past it 100 times, but it had never felt this heavy before today. David poured coffee and looked at me with the caution of a man holding a truth that could make someone bleed. "What did Robert tell you?" 8 years ago, after a fundraiser that Thomas Whitmore attended, he finally sat down with me, maybe because he saw the Whitmore name being praised on donor plaques while his own contribution had been buried. What else did he say? That he had let a friend steal the most important thing in his life without fighting back. He stayed silent because he was afraid you would drag the whole family into a legal war. My eyes closed tightly. Had Robert understood me and feared for me that much? David opened a drawer and pulled out a thin brown envelope in my late husband's handwriting. Inside was a slip of paper with one name on it, Harold Baines, along with an old address and one short line. He was in the room when Thomas switched the terms and told you to trust the new draft. I've never met this man. He used to be an internal accountant for that group. Robert said he witnessed the negotiation that changed everything. Do you know anything else? Only that Robert carried this like a stone in his chest. He didn't forgive it. He just didn't want to drag you and the children into the mud. A bitter smile spread across my face, the taste of it sharp on my tongue. Robert had chosen to protect us, but in the end, the truth had still found its way right to the door. The following afternoon, through David's referral, I met with attorney Jackson Moore. His office was in an old red brick building near the harbor, not flashy at all, just thick with the smell of coffee and shelves full of heavy law books. Jackson looked about 45, with straight shoulders and a handshake firm enough to make me feel steadier. The tin box, Robert's letter, and my medical file were laid out one by one across his desk. I'm not sure I'm here to file a lawsuit. I just need to know what is really happening to my life. Jackson didn't offer empty comfort. He put on his glasses and read every page carefully for a full 40 minutes, occasionally asking about timelines and names. I told him everything. Amanda Whitmore's diagnosis, Sarah's stack of brochures, even the $12,000 referral fee. When he heard Amanda's name, his eyes lifted from the file. Thomas Whitmore's daughter? I only found that out yesterday. Do you think it's connected? I think too many things are starting to line up in a way that feels anything but easy. Let me be straight with you. I can't promise we'll win. This is old, and the statute of limitations and overlapping terms make it very complicated. What Robert left behind matters, but it's not enough to turn the whole game around overnight. My shoulders sagged. I hadn't come here for encouragement, but the truth always carries a bitter taste. Jackson tapped a finger lightly against my medical file. But there's a more important piece, the present. You have Parkinson's. Your doctor is the daughter of your husband's enemy. Your daughter is being pushed by a middleman service to move you into assisted living. And all of this is happening at the exact moment you found those old documents. What do you see when you look at all that? Jackson looked me straight in the eye. I see that if Thomas Whitmore suspects Robert left any papers behind in that house, then your leaving would benefit him far too much. How exactly? Once you move out, the house gets cleaned out, sold, or opened up to outsiders. Old documents disappear without a trace. You lose the familiar ground under your feet and become much easier to describe as a patient with diminished capacity. And most important of all, the words of an elderly woman in assisted living always carry less weight than the words of a woman still living independently in the home she has held onto for 45 years. The final curtain in my mind had just been ripped open. You think Thomas is after the house? I think he's after everything that might still be inside it, and after stripping you of your standing. All because of some old documents? Jackson opened another folder on his computer. Not just the past. Thomas Whitmore is preparing to sell his family clinic chain to a major corporation. If a scandal involving intellectual property fraud or patient manipulation breaks right now, the value of that deal could evaporate. He isn't just hiding history. He's protecting money. I stared at him without blinking. Everything finally had a clear target. This was no longer about old men nursing old resentment. This was a siege happening in the present, with people willing to tighten the screws on a sick widow to protect reputation and profit. Jackson leaned forward. What you need to understand is this. This is no longer just your husband's pain. This is a direct risk to you. What do I need to do? Not sue yet, and not confront anyone yet. First, secure the house better, Change the garage code, back up the documents. Request the full medical records, not just the summary. I need the name Harold Baines, and I need every text message and brochure your daughter has been holding on to. What about Dr. Amanda? We need to move step by step. Before making any accusation, you need an independent professional evaluation. But I can promise you this medical file is going to be examined down to every last comma. By the time I left Jackson's office, Charleston was already sliding into late afternoon, the harbor wind carrying the smell of salt. Sitting in the car, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, white hair bright at my temples. A widow who had just been told she had Parkinson's. This should have been the moment I gave up, leaned on my children, and accepted whatever arrangement they made for me. The engine vibrated softly beneath my hands on the steering wheel, but what I had just heard had awakened something entirely different. Not strength, something colder. A hard clarity running down my spine. Thomas Whitmore didn't just want to rob Robert. He wanted to make sure I disappeared too before I ever had the chance to demand justice. The car rolled slowly away from the harbor. This fight no longer belonged only to the dead. That night I stayed awake at the kitchen table. Reading and rereading the part where Robert wrote about staying silent to protect the family, I asked myself what that piece had really cost. Outside the window, an oak branch brushed lightly against the glass. The house seemed to draw inward around the ticking clock and the dry scrape of that old letter. By the time dawn was near, I understood something. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just stolen and walked away. He was trying to make sure that by the end of my life, I would never get the chance to gather back what had been taken. The pain in my chest no longer felt like the fragile sorrow of a widow. It had hardened into something colder, sharper, and utterly clear. I used to think betrayal only had one face. Later I understood there was the kind born from greed, and the kind born from weakness dressed up as reason. Sarah and Benjamin were both. The most painful part was that I couldn't hate them the way I hated outsiders. After meeting with Jackson, I saw my two children more clearly, like objects after the dust had been wiped away. Not prettier, just easier to see the cracks in. Friday night, Sarah brought groceries over. I called all day and couldn't get you. You should keep your phone on you. Sarah. Just that one word. Sarah. And she knew I was no longer standing where I'd been a few weeks earlier. Her eyes moved to the stack of files tucked beneath my recipe book. What is that? Why is there so much of it? My records. I need to know how other people have been reading my life. I don't understand why you have to turn this into a battlefield, Mom. Because someone else turned it into a battlefield before I ever did. She turned away and ran water into the glass, the sound of it striking the glass sharp and hard. You always think that anyone who doesn't do what you want is wrong. When Michael died, when Dad got sick, and now this. I'm tired, Mom. Tired of always being the one who stays. Benjamin is my child, too. He only sends money. She cut in. He's in California. Who's the one rushing over here in the middle of the night? Who's the one lifting you up when you slip and fall? Me. None of that was untrue, and because it was true, it hurt me more than it made me angry. I sat down, my hand resting against the cool wood. You have every right to be tired, every right to be afraid, but you do not have the right to turn that fear into a stack of paperwork and let strangers decide what happens to my life. You love to talk principles, but bills don't pay themselves, old people don't get younger on their own, and accidents don't send warnings. And real life doesn't hand a child $12,000 unless that child pushes her mother far enough away. I told you, it's a service fee. Call it whatever you want. It's still money. And what about Ben? Is he flying back here? In the end, all of this still lands on me. She slammed the glass down hard, water splashing across the counter. I teach all day, Mark lost his job, the kids have school, and credit card debt is chasing me through every hour of sleep. I open my eyes and all I see is money. And on top of that, I have to lie there worrying that you'll fall, that you'll forget your medication. I'm exhausted. For the first time, she was telling the truth, not to confess, but to defend herself. I looked at the face of the child I had once held through feverish nights, and now it carried the strain of adulthood, that place where love slowly starts giving way to calculation. So that made you think you had the right to decide my life for me? If no one else is going to do it, then yes. That was when I understood. Sarah's wrongdoing had not started with greed. It had started with the feeling of being left behind with too much weight on her shoulders, and then giving herself permission to overstep in order to make up for it. That $12,000 was only the drop that made the cup overflow. Benjamin was different. I called him the next morning. "Did you know Sarah was taking money from a middleman service to move me into assisted living?" "She didn't tell me about that money. But Mom, I don't think Sarah wants to hurt you. Don't think for her. Tell me the truth. Where do you stand in all of this?" Benjamin went quiet. I heard him move the phone to a quieter corner, the way he always did when he had to face something real. "I can't stay in Charleston long. I know that sounds terrible, but I can't breathe there." "Why?" "Because Michael died there, because Dad got sick there. The smell of hospitals and cemeteries makes me want to throw up. Every time I come back, I feel like I'm that helpless teenage boy again, standing in the middle of a house falling apart." So I left. I went as far away as I could and let the distance do the work for me. I sat there in silence for a moment. For the first time, fear had finally been called by its real name. "So you used money to buy your absence?" "Maybe." "And left Sarah to carry all the hard parts?" "Maybe." "Why didn't you say that?" "Because saying it out loud sounds pathetic." "But staying silent doesn't make it any less pathetic, Benjamin." His tired laugh came through the line. "I know. Do you want me to come home?" The word yes almost slipped out. But with someone like him, 3 days of playing the perfect son would only end in another escape. A weekend flight fixes nothing when the truth is still being avoided. "You'll come, but not today. First, I need you to understand something. Standing outside of it doesn't make your hands any cleaner." He said nothing after that. I heard only a long breath and the distant sound of an ambulance somewhere on his end of the line. By Sunday afternoon at Grace Methodist, the soft, careful concern had already started closing in around me. News in Charleston travels fast through quiet, carpeted hallways. "You should rest, Isabella. At your age, peace matters most. The Whitmore family is powerful. Digging into old matters will only wear you out." I understood immediately. All of that moral advice was really a trap laid to clear the path for silence. Forgive, let it go, enjoy your old age. It sounded compassionate, but really it was just the polite way of telling an old woman not to disturb the order everyone had grown comfortable with. Only Pastor David stood beside me in the empty hallway. "Are you all right?" "I'm starting to understand my children more than I ever wanted to, David." He looked out at the old oak tree in the yard and nodded. "Betrayal from strangers makes us angry. Betrayal from family leaves us drained. I don't know which one hurts more. Probably the second one, because we still have to love them." What David said lodged in my throat like something bitter. He handed me a slip of paper with Harold Baines's new address in Columbia. I folded it carefully, the way a person holds onto a last thread of hope. "If I keep going, would Robert have wanted that? Robert wanted you to know he wasn't blind. What you do with that truth belongs to the living." When I got home, I stood still in the living room. Robert's chair, the old lamp, Michael's photo at 17. The house was the same, but I was no longer looking at it through the eyes of an old woman counting down her remaining days. I was trapped between two kinds of betrayal: a daughter so close she wanted to take the wheel out of her mother's hands, and a son so far away he used money to avoid pain. And somewhere between those two stood Harold Baines, the only living witness to the afternoon Thomas Whitmore switched out the future of my family. The wind moved through the dry leaves outside with the sound of paper tearing. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. Life almost never waits for us to be ready. It just opens the door and forces us to step through it. I had read thousands of medical records in my life, but never once had that chill down my spine come from seeing my own name at the top of the page. At Jackson's suggestion, I requested the full copy instead of the usual summary. Monday morning, after 30 minutes of waiting in the medical center hallway, I was handed a thick stack of papers clipped together with a large metal fastener. I brought it home, spread it across the dining table, put on my glasses, picked up a pencil, and started going through it the way I had done for 30 years in medicine. Isabella Rosewood, female, 67 years old. The first page looked normal enough, but the deeper I went into the progress notes, the tighter my stomach pulled. Patient reports tremor, occasional loss of balance, lives alone in multi-level home, safety concerns discussed, family support encouraged. Not false, but not complete. I turned the page. Observed bradykinesia appearing more significant than patient acknowledges. Insight into progressive functional risks may be limited. The phrase insight may be limited hit the record like a needle. To an outsider, it looked harmless. To people in the profession, it was an indirect way of describing a patient as confused or not fully lucid. If a line like that appears often enough, a person can lose the right to decide for herself before she even realizes it. I marked the margin lightly with my pencil. On another page, Amanda had written, "Strongly recommend consideration of structured supportive living environment in near future. Strongly recommend." In the appointment itself, Amanda had only spoken gently about considering it early. But in the file, she used strongly, one full step tighter. Worse still was the added prescription for a sedative for agitation. In older people, that kind of medication only slows reflexes and makes falls more likely. I had worked long enough to know this was no harmless oversight. Wednesday, I drove alone to Columbia to see Dr. Lawrence Keene. After a careful evaluation, he took off his glasses and spoke evenly. "This file describes your condition as more impaired than what I'm observing, and that sedative would make you sluggish for no good reason. Will you put that in writing for me?" He nodded. When I took the independent evaluation from his hand, my heartbeat turned heavier. It was confirmation. Someone had been deliberately bending my life out of shape on paper. On the drive home, Jackson called. "Thomas Whitmore's law office just hired a private investigator. His name is Marco Diaz. To follow who? You." I stood still by the window, looking out at the backyard. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the ice maker clicking. The thought that someone might be documenting every hour I watered plants, collected the mail, or went to the grocery store made the house suddenly feel surrounded by invisible eyes. 3 days later, at 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. 3 short, hesitant taps. Through the slit in the curtain, I saw a thin young man in a gray hoodie, his shoulders hunched against the cold. I cracked the door open, leaving the chain on. "Who are you?" He looked at me, his eyes full of worry, though he was trying hard to stay steady. "My name is Carlos Diaz." That last name made my hand stop on the lock. "Marco Diaz's son. Please don't close the door. I just came to tell you something." I opened it a little wider, still keeping the chain in place. "What is it?" "My dad is working for Whitmore's people, and I don't think they're only watching you." The wind carried in the smell of damp leaves from the porch. Under the yellow porch light, Carlos's face looked exhausted, as if he had fought with himself for a long time before standing here. "Why should I believe you?" Carlos swallowed hard. "Because my mom got cancer treatment where you worked. Back then, my family didn't understand any of it, and you were the one who explained the treatment plan and helped us find a medication assistance fund. My dad may have forgotten that. My mom never did. Neither did I." I went still for a moment. A memory surfaced from far away. A thin woman with short hair, sitting in the chemotherapy hallway holding her purse, with a little boy beside her doing homework. "Rosa?" "Yes, ma'am. That's my mother. Come in." Carlos stepped inside cautiously and perched on the edge of the chair at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tight. "Tell me." He hesitated, stopping every so often to find the right words, but his eyes stayed steady. "At first, my dad said it was just regular surveillance, watching where you went, whether anyone came to the house. But 2 days ago, I overheard him on the phone. They want to break in and take documents. They want to know where you keep the hospital records." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I also saw him carrying a long lens, and he said they wanted pictures of you going up the stairs by yourself." Every joint in my fingers turned cold. "Does your father know you came here?" Carlos shook his head. "If he knew, he'd kill me." "Then why did you still come?" He looked down at the table and sat in silence for a long moment. "When my mom was sick, you were the only person who stayed and explained things to her like she was a human being, not just a file. She said some debts can't be repaid with money. I couldn't stand by and watch my dad do this without saying anything." I looked at that 19-year-old boy and heard the slight tremor in his last words, and something bitter rose in my throat. This had crossed into something else now. It was no longer just suspicion on paper or tilted notes in a file. They wanted to know where I kept the documents. They wanted proof of my isolation and fragility. Who hired your father directly? I'm not completely sure, but they mentioned Whitmore's law office. I nodded slowly. Carlos, listen to me. From now on, do not say anything to your father, and do not act differently around him. Do you understand? He nodded. I quickly wrote Jackson's phone number on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table to him. If anything else happens, call this number. Do not call me when your father is nearby, and absolutely do not text anything sensitive. Carlos took the paper, his hand heavy with tension. When I walked him to the door, he turned back and said quietly, "Please be careful." I answered with only a silent nod as I watched him disappear into the dark. When the door shut, I stood with my back against the cold wood for a long time. No lights, no television, only wind pushing at the house and my heart pounding hard in my chest. It was clear now. They didn't just want control. They were waiting for me to stumble, waiting for enough confusion or slowness to convince the world that this woman had lost the ability to govern herself, that she could no longer keep her home, and certainly should not be allowed to keep her voice. I walked straight into the kitchen and gathered every key to the side door, the back door, and the garage, lining them up on the table. A second later, I was on the phone with Jackson. You were right. This is no longer just surveillance. The line went still for a beat. I'm listening. For the first time in weeks, the feeling of being cornered disappeared. I knew where I stood on the board now. The situation was terrible. But at least sitting in the dark and knowing exactly who your enemy is better than being a bewildered prey animal. I cannot remember the last time I felt this calm, this cold. Maybe it was the night I stood outside the emergency room after Michael's accident. When pain sinks deep enough, tears eventually make room for reason. The next morning, Jackson was waiting for me at his office. The files were no longer spread out everywhere. They had been divided into 2 separate stacks. We are not going to force all of this into one single case, he said the moment I sat down. That would only weaken us. He pushed the stack on the left toward me. This is the civil front. Then he pointed to the stack on the right. And this is the medical and ethics fight. I stayed quiet, waiting for him to explain. If we turn this into one giant war, they'll twist the story into an old, fragile woman imagining things because she's been broken by past grief. I'm not handing them that gift. He opened the civil file. Here, we focus on Robert. Drafts, letters, and witnesses proving the terms were changed to strip him of what was his. We reclaim your standing as his lawful heir. I nodded. That part was painful, but clear. It belonged to the past, and the past had finally been named. Jackson moved on to the second file. Over here, we do not accuse Amanda of poisoning you. We go after her professionally. Biased notes, undisclosed conflict of interest, and using family connections to distort a medical assessment in order to strip a patient of her autonomy. Do you think the medical board will take it? They'll have to. The minute the file is opened, the balance of power shifts. In medicine and in churches, people fear scandal even more than they fear wrongdoing. Jackson pulled a draft from the middle of the desk. And there's one more thing. Thomas's side just sent over a preliminary settlement offer. The wording was polite in a way that felt almost sickening. They admitted no wrongdoing. They simply expressed a desire to resolve matters privately in order to avoid emotional harm to all parties. My eyes stopped on the number at the bottom of the page. It was big enough to make someone drowning in debt like Sarah lose her footing, big enough to fix up the house, pay off debt, put Josh through college, and even buy another small apartment if I wanted. It was the perfect trap, using money to buy silence in the name of justice. What do you think? I think they're trying to see how much pain you're in and how badly you want peace. What if I sign? Robert disappears from the story one more time, Jackson said, his voice turning hard. You get the money, they buy silence. Whitmore protects the deal, and Amanda cleans up the medical file on her end. On the surface, everything looks spotless again, like there was never a stain to begin with. My eyes lingered on that number longer than I expected. It would be a lie to say I didn't waver at all. An old woman living on a modest pension doesn't easily ignore the relief of no longer having to worry about roof repairs or the burden of family debt. But then Robert came back to me, along with the line he had left behind. I realized very early. I just never fought back. He had lived his whole life with that stone pressing on his chest to keep peace for the family. If I let exhaustion make me put my name on that paper now, it would be no different than placing another stone on his grave with my own hand. "I'm not signing," Jackson nodded, not surprised. In his eyes, I caught a flicker of quiet respect. Right then, my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "I'm coming by with lunch, okay?" I looked at the screen, then up at him. "How much does she need to know?" "That's up to you," he said. "But be careful. People caught between fear and money often do things they convince themselves are for the family." When I got home, Sarah was already waiting. One look at my face and she guessed it immediately. "You went to see the lawyer again?" "Yes." "Is it really that serious, Mom?" I pulled the draft settlement out of the envelope and laid it neatly on the table. Sarah skimmed it, then stopped at the last page. The moment that number ran through her mind was plain to see. The exhaustion from bills, credit card debt, and Josh's tuition. That blink of hesitation was not unforgivable, but it was something worth remembering. "They offered this much?" "Yes." "And you turned it down?" "I'm not signing." Sarah set the paper down harder than she needed to. "If you take it, this all ends. You won't have to go to court. You won't have to be in the news." "You mean we won't have to disturb the polished image of the Whitmore family?" "I didn't say that. I just think you're tired and you're sick. You don't need another war." I looked at my daughter. I could see exactly where she was standing. Half of her wanted to protect me, and the other half wanted everything to stay quiet so her own life would not be thrown off balance. "I'm not dead yet," I said, "and this house is not part of anybody's plan." Sarah went silent. I didn't raise my voice, but the words were heavy enough to leave the whole kitchen still for a few seconds. After Sarah left, Jackson and I began to move. We changed the garage code, added more locks, backed up every document. The medical file and the independent evaluation were sent straight to the state medical board. Every detail, from the surveillance to the private settlement offer, was laid out in a precise timeline. Harold Baines was still alive in Columbia. Jackson had someone reach out. There had been no response yet, but at least the door had cracked open. My life moved into a different chapter. It was no longer the daily life of a sick old woman surrounded by children offering advice. It became a life of files, letters, and short phone calls with Jackson. "Where are you keeping the originals?" "Not in the house anymore." "Anyone lingering around the yard?" "A black car sat at the end of the street for 3 minutes. I got the license plate." Strangely enough, in the middle of all that exhaustion, my heart shook less. Fear now had a name and a direction. My enemies were no longer shadows. They were Thomas Whitmore and Amanda, people who believed they could clear an old widow out of the way before she understood what she was holding. A week later, Jackson called early in the afternoon. "The civil complaint is ready. The medical board has accepted the file too." I was standing by the sink, looking out at the backyard where the last chrysanthemums of the season were drooping in the sun. "When this goes public, all of Charleston will know," I said. "Yes, I hate that." "I know, but I hate being erased from my own life more." Jackson was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then he said, "Then we keep going." I set the phone down, my hand resting against the cool edge of the sink. Across the street, my neighbor was still out trimming her roses. A car rolled slowly past the corner. The sunlight slanted across the yard the way it always did. If you're still here with me, hit like and share this video before you keep going. Because from that moment on, I was no longer the woman who sat still waiting for people to tidy up her life. Only one thing had changed. From that moment on, I was no longer someone who just endured whatever came crashing down on me. I had stepped into the phase where every closed door would start getting knocked open. And once that first door gave way, this whole town was going to understand how some people had tried to erase my name from my own life. When the truth started leaking out in Charleston, it didn't explode. It spread fast like a crack running through porcelain glaze. People pretended not to notice, right up until they couldn't ignore it anymore. The civil complaint was filed in early February. Quiet process, but effective. Within a week, I could already feel the different looks at church and at the grocery store. The cashier told me to stay strong, while Mrs. Parker, who had always worshipped the Whitmore family, avoided looking me in the eye. The first article appeared on a local news site under a cautious headline about a civil lawsuit involving a prominent philanthropist. Reading those lines, I felt ashamed and relieved at the same time. Ashamed that my private life was being exposed, but relieved because the truth had finally stepped out of the dark. Jackson handled everything exactly as planned, slowly and precisely. First came Robert's legacy. The journals, letters, and drafts were authenticated by a document expert as genuine, not fabricated. "No one can call this imagination anymore," Jackson said as he set the report on the table. Then came Harold Baines. He was living alone in Columbia, his voice weak now, but his memory still sharp. Harold's notarized statement hit the door of truth like a hard shove. He confirmed that Thomas had pressured Robert to sign procedural terms with empty promises about what he would receive. The pattern of deceit started to come into focus through the testimony of a third-party witness. At the same time, the medical side was moving too. The state board began a procedural review of Amanda Whitmore. The biased notes in my file and Dr. Keene's independent assessment were more than enough for them to demand an internal explanation. The board was set. I was no longer a sick woman waiting to be handed whatever others decided. I was the one holding the scale. Some doctors are very good at performing compassion in front of patients, but they give themselves away in emails to colleagues because they think that's the safe place. Amanda's extracted emails exposed a naked truth. She discussed with system management the urgency of arranging supportive living placement for me, a phrase that reached far beyond medical caution. In another message, Amanda wrote, "The patient's resistance may complicate safe transition planning," even though at that point, no clear plan had ever been honestly presented to me for me to resist. To the professional board, that was no longer caution. It was dangerous bias. When word leaked that Amanda was under investigation, the second article appeared, and this time the headline no longer sounded careful. That was also when my phone began ringing non-stop with unknown calls that left no messages, and Sarah showed up at my door with the face of someone living on chronic sleeplessness. "You're taking this too far, Mom," she said the moment she stepped inside. "Too far for who?" "Everyone at school knows about this." "Does that embarrass you?" Sarah said nothing. She held her hot coffee cup with both hands like she was looking for warmth. "I don't know how I'm supposed to face people." "You could start with the truth. The truth that my mother is suing the most powerful family in town, and I'm the daughter who once tried to put her in assisted living?" Sarah looked up, her eyes red with confusion and anger at herself. "I never thought it would go this far." "Of course you didn't. Because you never stopped to ask yourself why you were in such a hurry to get rid of your mother in the first place." She lowered her head. I looked at the swirl at the crown of my daughter's hair, and suddenly remembered what she looked like at 7 years old when she knew she had done wrong and had no way to argue herself out of it. 3 days later, Benjamin flew back to Charleston without telling me first. When I opened the door and saw my son standing there with a small suitcase and a tired face, I realized how much he had aged. Benjamin walked into the house like a familiar guest who still did not quite belong there. He made one slow round past Robert's chair and Michael's photograph, then stopped in the kitchen. "Are you okay, Mom? Look for yourself." He gave a bitter little smile. That night, the two of us sat at the table until late. For the first time, Benjamin did not dodge anything. "I read the articles," he said. "I hate people talking about our family like this." "Our family has always lived inside things we hated." Benjamin nodded, his eyes fixed on his hands clasped together. "I believed Sarah because believing her made everything easier for me." "I know." "No, Mom. I mean, I saw her carrying the load, so I just let her decide. I told myself that because she was close by, she understood things better. But the truth is, I was avoiding it. I didn't want to come back here and smell hospital rooms. I didn't want to drive past the cemetery. And I definitely didn't want to look at Dad's chair and face the fact that he's gone." His voice caught. I did not rush to comfort him. Some confessions arrive too late, and if you soothe them too quickly, they lose the weight they need to keep. "You left me and your sister to figure it out on your own." "Yes." "And you called that being busy." "Yes." "But really, it was cowardice." Benjamin looked up at me, straight on, pain plain in his face. Then he gave a small nod. Yes. On the other side, Thomas Whitmore stayed hidden behind layers of lawyers. But when the third article publicly raised questions about the conflict of interest between my medical file and his family, the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Jackson told me their tone had started to change. No more arrogant talk about a desire to settle. Now they were trying to figure out how many cards we were really holding. What is he most afraid of? He's afraid this stops being personal, Jackson said. It's starting to threaten his deal directly, along with that philanthropist image. A week later, Amanda had to attend her first hearing before the medical board. She didn't collapse the way people do in movies. She stayed polished and professional, arguing that every recommendation came from caution in treating an elderly patient living alone. But that polished professionalism started to look thin when placed beside the internal emails, the sedative prescriptions, and the concealed family connection to my husband's rival. She doesn't have to confess, Jackson told me after the hearing. The board only needs to see that outside motives walked into that exam room with her. The mandatory mediation took place in an old stone building near the square. I wore the Navy outfit Robert used to like best, and my small pearl earrings. My hands still shook when I fastened the buttons, but it was no longer the blurred trembling of someone cornered with no way out. Thomas Whitmore sat across from me. After 20 years, he had aged the way wealthy men do. Elegant, charcoal suit, thin watch. Only his eyes were unchanged. The eyes of someone used to winning by waiting for the other person to grow tired. He gave me a slight polite nod, as if we were at a church luncheon. I did not answer it. There was no pounding on tables, no shouting, just the cold language of law. Thomas still tried to call Robert an early contributor instead of a partner, and he used the word misunderstanding in place of concealment. But Jackson started laying stones on the table one by one. The document authentication, Harold Baines's statement, Robert's handwritten letter, Amanda's investigation file, and proof that a private investigator had been following me. Thomas stopped leaning back in his chair. When Jackson calmly stated that we were prepared to make public the full story of a family that built a legacy by erasing another man's name and trying to crush his widow, I saw Thomas tighten his grip on his pen. He did not confess. He only said, "Isabella, I'm sorry if Robert ever felt—" "Felt?" I said. "You didn't steal a feeling from my husband. You stole a piece of his life." The whole room went still. The mediation ended without an apology. Whitmore's side asked for time to reconsider the number. 3 days later, a new offer came in, much larger than the first. They were scrambling now, trying to shut the door before it flew off its hinges. The agreement was signed. Not because Thomas felt remorse, but because the balance of risk had turned against him. He could not afford to lose the deal and his reputation over a drawn-out civil suit. That same week, the medical board suspended Amanda Whitmore pending the ethics investigation. The fourth article made the front page. Charleston watched the polished glaze of the Whitmore family crack and peel away in pieces. Invitations were canceled. Charities removed his name. In this town, the harshest judgment is sometimes nothing more than people no longer lowering their heads to greet you. And yet that night, I did not feel the relief I had imagined. I sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and watching the yellow light spill across the wooden table. On paper, I had won. I kept the house, made Thomas pay, and saw Amanda punished. But in front of me was another fight, one harder than any investigation file. I had to face my 2 children. I had to decide whether there was still room for them in whatever remained of my life. Winning against outsiders only takes evidence. Winning against the people inside your own home takes something far more painful. It took me a long time to understand one bitter truth. Attacks from outsiders may hurt, but at least you know what you're up against. With family, the hardest part is not getting justice back. It is accepting the truth that there are people you love who, even if the love is still there, must never be allowed to cross your boundaries again. People like to think that once the truth comes out, everything will naturally go back to where it was. Not really. The truth only clears the table. Who still gets to sit there and who has to step away is a different matter. On Sunday morning, Sarah came by without warning. I heard the keys rattling at the door, and she walked in looking hollow-faced, without a trace of makeup. She stopped right at the kitchen doorway, awkward like a stranger. "Can I come in, Mom?" "You already did." I pointed to the chair across from me. Sarah sat down and quietly watched me finish slicing an apple. The knife tapping against the plate was the only sound in the kitchen. I called Harbor. I canceled everything, she said first. Good. I also called the bank and returned the referral fee. Good. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the back of her hand. A tear fell, and she wiped it away quickly like she was ashamed. I didn't start all this from cruelty the way you think. At first I was really scared, Sarah continued. Scared you'd fall down the stairs, scared you'd forget your medication, scared the police would call in the middle of the night. I was angry because I lived nearby, so I was always the one who had to rush over, handle everything, carry it all, while Ben was far away. I didn't dare say it out loud because I was afraid I'd sound selfish. She paused, her voice tightening. Then Mark lost his job, Josh got into college, and the money pressure just kept piling up. Harbor showed up at exactly the right time, sounding so professional. They talked about safety, medical support. And then there was that fee. She gave a crooked little laugh. At the time, I told myself that after everything I was carrying, taking a little compensation was only fair. That was when you started lying to yourself. I know. The worst part wasn't the money, I continued. It was that you stopped seeing your mother as someone who still had the right to decide her own life. That was when Sarah really cried. Not loudly, just her shoulders shaking hard. I looked at my daughter, my chest aching, but I did not soften right away. I don't hate you, I said, but I don't trust you the way I used to. Sarah looked up, her face wet with tears. What do I have to do, Mom? From now on, you do not make decisions for me about anything. Not paperwork, not doctors, not the house. If you want to stay in my life, you have to learn boundaries all over again. She nodded over and over. I will. And you're going to St. Luke's Senior Care Center every week, for 1 year. Sarah stared at me. A year? Yes, not to repay a debt to me, but so you can spend enough time looking at the people whose children pushed them away and forgot them, before you forget how terrifying that feels. She pressed her lips together, then gave a small nod. Okay. Benjamin stepped into the kitchen just as we finished. He must have been standing in the hallway long enough to know not to interrupt. He pulled out a chair and sat at the end of the table, his face tired after a night on the sofa. Your turn. I folded my arms and did not help him begin. Benjamin rubbed his face, slowly pulling each word up from his chest. I don't have a referral fee to return, and I wasn't planning to sell the house. But my fault isn't any lighter than Sarah's. He tightened his hands on the table. I ran, from Charleston, from the pain of Dad, from Michael. I turned distance into a fake kind of morality. I'd send money, make my scheduled calls, and let myself feel like I was a decent person. The heaviest parts, the real parts, I left for you and Sarah to carry. Looking at my oldest child, I saw the shadow of the 9-year-old boy who used to grin proudly over a bookshelf he had built himself. Life and avoidance had covered him in too many layers. What do you want me to say? Nothing. I just wanted to call the truth by its name first. That sentence eased my heart more than any polished apology could have. You do not fix this with one flight home, I said plainly. I do not need you coming back for 3 days and disappearing again. Come to Charleston more often. Be truly present. Share the weight. And if you can't do that, don't promise it. Benjamin nodded. I will. And stop using money as a blindfold. For the first time in days, the corner of his mouth lifted a little, a sad smile. Yes, Mom. I did not hug either of them that day. Some distances turn false if you try to close them too fast. We just sat there, the 3 of us in the old kitchen, listening to the clock tick and the branches brushing against each other outside. For the first time in a long while, no one was lying anymore about where they stood. The weeks after that were not a miracle. Sarah started going to St. Luke's every Wednesday afternoon. After the first week, she came home pale and told me about an elderly woman who had waited 3 hours for her son in vain. I just nodded. By the 3rd week, she brought over cake and told me about an old man who kept insisting on going home to fix his porch step himself because he was afraid no one else knew where the loose spot was. I could see the lesson sinking into my daughter. Benjamin kept his word and came every 6 weeks. Even when he still seemed awkward, like a guest renting a room, he stayed. He went with me to doctor's appointments, called a contractor to fix the railing, and sat out on the back porch until late afternoon, instead of fleeing the way he used to. I used the settlement money to repair the roof, install handrails, replace the bathtub with a walk-in shower, and add motion sensor lights along the path. Those changes were not surrender to old age. They were my way of refusing to let anyone use my physical decline as an excuse to push me out. The Robert Rosewood Fund was established at the beginning of summer to support patients in financial hardship and provide legal guidance for elderly people being pressured out of their homes. Carlos Diaz received the first scholarship in August. Looking at that young man in his white shirt, too broad in the shoulders for it, I understood that life does not give back what was lost. But it does give us a way to keep pain from becoming meaningless. Thomas Whitmore disappeared almost completely from public view. His deal lost value, charities removed his name, and Charleston no longer called him a symbol of the community. For me, that was enough. Amanda was no longer practicing clinical medicine here either. She made me sad more than angry because a woman with her education had chosen to step into that ugliness when she had plenty of ways out. One afternoon in March, both Benjamin and Sarah were there. I pointed to a young oak tree I had just bought from the nursery. "Help me plant this." The three of us went out into the backyard. Benjamin dug the hole. Sarah packed the soil. I took hold of the shovel, too. My hands still shook. That tremor will probably stay with me forever. But this time it did not carry fear with it. We worked in silence, with nothing but the sound of dirt falling and birds calling by the fence. When the oak was standing firm, I poured the first stream of water at its roots. I looked at my two children, one less sharp-edged now, the other less inclined to run. We would never go back to the way we were before, but this broken version was more honest than the old polished one had ever been. "I do not need you to save me," I said. "I only need you not to push me out of my own life ever again." Sarah lowered her head. Benjamin looked at the oak. No one made grand promises. The Charleston spring wind moved softly, and dirt still clung under my nails. The old house still stood there, no newer, no bigger, but at last it was completely mine. For the first time in a very long while, no one in that garden was looking at me like something that was about to be moved out. At this age, I finally understand that once some things break, there is no putting them back the way they were. But people can still go on living with dignity, as long as their boundaries and self-respect remain intact. Maybe real peace is not being loved the way you once were. Maybe it is no longer allowing anyone to use love as a reason to arrange your life for you. If Isabella's story touched you, please like this video. Share it with someone who has also had to learn how to hold on to their dignity, and tell me where you're watching from. And stay with the channel, because there are still many more stories here about family, betrayal, and standing back up late without it being too late. Every story here is built with support from AI during the creation process, but each one is carefully edited again with human emotion, experience, and judgment.